Okay, thanks very much everyone for attending. It looks like my name is Grant J. I'm one of the directors here on the sales side at EDP's SchedulePro, and just appreciate everybody's time today. It looks like we have a great cross-section from the petrochem refineries and manufacturing field, so thank you very much. And just a couple of housekeeping notes here. If anybody has any questions, there's a chat box at the bottom of your GoToMeeting. Please feel free to use that, or if you want to write this down to send an email, we'll answer either at info@edpsoftware.com. That's info@edpsoftware.com. And there are two ways you can ask questions throughout this. If there's anything that's really pertinent to the speaker's agenda items as we walk through, we'll probably stop and let those be answered. Otherwise, feel free to ask them and we can address them at the end, or we'll send out a subsequent email to everybody who attended with the link of the webinar and maybe even a copy of the deck that we go through here today. So thanks very much again. If there's any other questions, feel free to ask them through those 2 points. And then I just want to quickly introduce our keynote speakers today. We have Sachin Agrawal, our CEO, and also Billy GOODHART. William Billy GOODHART, one of the principals. Lots of industry experience, as you can see here, 25 years labor relations, 40 years in Exxon Mobil and international, and he's been the past chair of some of the AFPM committees on human relations, labor relations, human resources, and the National Industrial Relations Group. So thank you very much, Billy, for attending here with us today. And we'll be passing this over to Sachin right now to start our webinar. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Sean, Grant, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this discussion. I'm looking forward to having a chance to talk to you and answering some questions. Overall agenda for today is that we were going to go through just a quick recap of what we discussed in our previous webinar about RP755, addressing some of the key changes to the industry that have occurred, and then walking through how a scheduling tool can help you with compliance with RP755 and what's changing with the revision 2 of RP755 that is going to be released imminently. So just to kick off and move in, dive right in, we'll just do a quick recap of some of the key items that we discussed in the last webinar. It is available online on our website, and we will send a link out to that with the follow-up of this talk as well. So just a quick background, in the last talk we did discuss the hours of service rules that are part of RP755 and how those areas do create some complexity based off of the way the rules are written. And then also discussed how the other things that must be accounted for inside of a refinery or petrochemical operation is really critical. So things like union, collective bargaining agreements, labor laws, and other regulations all need to be worked on together. And some of the key considerations that were hitting individuals that when they are rolling out RP755, there are challenges always with any new system or any new initiative. And so these were some of the key things to keep in mind as part of a rollout. We talked through those. So again, if you have any questions, happy to discuss them in the questions at the end, or we can go through that at another time. One of the areas that drove part of this webinar was at the end of the last one, there was a lot of discussions about the version 2 of RP755 that was imminent. More details of that have come out, so we'll talk about that near the end of this talk. So two big changes that have occurred in the industry. The first one is that the national level bargaining with the USW has concluded, and there was a letter of agreement concerning RP755. And here's a quote from the USW newsletter that was sent out. And you know, and these matters of deep understanding of the negotiations, I'm actually going to hand it over to Billy here, and maybe you can just kind of give us a overview of what the letter stated and what that means to the individuals here on the call.
Sure. And as most people on the call know, this is the third iteration of a side letter that was agreed to by the industry and the USW on API 755. There was one in 2012 and one in 2015. And just to highlight the key component of this side letter, and what I like about it is it's a little clearer than the previous ones. It basically says if the parties haven't met the provisions of the 2012 or 2015 National Oil Bargaining Letters of Agreement, or do not have local agreements or plant guideline policies in place, the party shall implement an FRMS that seeks to meet the principles and intent of API 755, including any provisions arising out of 2012, 2015 NOBP Letters of Agreement. So, I think it's really clear that what companies and local unions will be required to do is to negotiate something that is very similar to API 755. And the complicating factor, as Sachin alluded to early, is that we know there's version 2 coming out, and I think that's going to complicate it a little bit once version 2 is released, and people have to figure out how to comply with that. But that's the key piece that I just wanted to touch on, and it's going to require everybody to put a program in place.
So, Billy, when we talk about everyone, maybe you can highlight who would be included as part of that national letter and who's not.
Well, it's anybody who agrees to NOBP side agreements, right? There are, I forget how many contracts that are covered under the NOBP negotiations that have already agreed to these side agreements. There are some that don't. There are several contracts that don't have the NOBP side letter. Even with that said, there are some companies that, even though they don't have the letters of agreement, they have gone and implemented a program that complies with API 755. But this letter primarily addresses those companies, those sites that have accepted the 2019 NOBP side agreements.
Excellent. And just to move on then about the other big pieces, as we've mentioned a few times already, revision 2 of RP 755 is coming out. And just a quick, update on what has been publicly released. The committee that was making these changes has voted and approved on the second revision. And the standard is in final edits and final reviews. So as far as we've been told, and all expectations are that the release of this is going to be imminent, and I believe it is going to be officially released any day now. Per Billy's comment, it does create some complexity in terms of rollout. We'll discuss some of those items in the revision 2 portion. So coming back to FRMS and RP 755, as Billy mentioned, this RP 755 standard was built to describe what was required from an FRMS, and what we want to talk through here, what are all of the elements that RP 755 actually discusses? And when the agreement says you should meet the principles and the sort of the goals of RP 755, it's much more than just the hours of service guidelines that maybe get spoken about most frequently. And so this list of items, this comes straight out of the RP 755 fact sheet. And there's a link to that here on this slide, as you'll get. But also when you view the final version of the RP 755 standard, each of these titles basically is a section within that standard. So it does feel a little bit daunting, but when you actually look at it and see what's written in the standard, it isn't as bad as it may seem like. So there's a number of things that can be handled via software, and we'll talk about those. And then there are a handful of things that really are defined, that are, on the ground, things that are either people item or a process item that you need to look at. But the great thing is actually most of you are probably already doing all of this in your organizations. Your existing safety organizations and process safety organizations likely are doing many of these tasks. And when we look at the list here we have on that right-hand column, these are very standard items that you'll see. You know, roles and responsibilities, training are already occurring. In the revision 2 of the document, the work environment has some high-level descriptions on things that should be done, but basically there's the guidance is that the work environment should be safe and, you know, promote healthy workers and, you know, do things that help with fatigue. And then the only one that may be new to some organizations is this idea of doing individual risk assessments around fatigue management. And so when you think of an FRMS or fatigue risk management, there is no way to guarantee somebody isn't fatigued. You know, somebody may be stressed out or having a bad day or just didn't sleep well. And what this individual risk assessment really is training your managers and training staff to check up on each other and make sure that they look each other in the eye and say, are you in a state that you should be working? And then obviously the next item down on the list, doing incidents and near-miss investigations. These are all things that are pretty standard in the industry. So they're really on the people and process side of it. Most of this you probably already have or have a version of.
Hey, Sachin, this is Billy.
Yeah.
And I guess this is more of a question than a comment. So with the individual risk assessment and training that's needed to do that, don't you think it would be wise to sort of, I think a lot of companies did the training for supervisors, right, as far as being able to mitigate fatigue, spot fatigue, work the exception system was probably done back in that, you know, anywhere from 2010 to 2012, 2013. It may be time to sort of roll out a refresher, at least, with that training.
Yeah, that is really wise. I think definitely the standard talks about training and education for everybody at the facility, and make sure that everybody understands what is included in fatigue management. And definitely with any training program and any safety program, repetition and consistency are key. So 100% agree with what you're saying. On the software side, I'll walk through how SchedulePro solves some of these problems. And as Billy alluded to, you know, how you manage callouts and your exception process is something for you to have a definition, but to do that well, often a software program can very much help make sure that you keep yourself within the hours of service guidelines. So as we kind of walk through what it means here on the timeline for compliance, I think Billy, you talked through this a little bit, but in the letter that was discussed, there is the 90-day requirement to have a program in place and then 1 year to implement. So Billy, maybe you can just touch upon briefly what that 90-day requirement is and what would get us through that.
Well, the 90-day requirement is you really need to start the process, right? You need to sit down with your local union, start hashing out, you know, what it is you need to do to comply, what gaps there are in whatever current procedures you have, and understanding from a labor perspective what it is you do or don't have to negotiate. I've seen labor agreements most of the time. What it impacts is your overtime guidelines and how you administer your overtime guidelines. And I've seen contracts that actually say it's you know, management almost has discretion in determining what the overtime guidelines are. And in those cases, there's very little negotiations. In other areas, you have to go through renegotiating all your overtime guidelines to get in compliance. So it's really going through that whole process, understanding it, but the 90-day period is to start the process. And then you should be able to implement within 365 days. So for those that ratified you know, we're on the February 1 expiration date. You know, obviously the clock's already ticking. You're down to, you know, almost 30 days to start the process. And then you have till next February to actually implement.
All right. So I'll just jump into how automation can help with that transition through that implementation phase. So as you're looking at that 1-year deadline through next February, or based on your ratification date, what are some of the tools that can help you and automate those items that were on that left-hand column? So the question that, you know, I think is explored a little bit, we talked about in the first webinar, but to talk through is, you know, with all of those other pieces of complexity, with other rules and the other parts of the agreements that you have to deal with, especially overtime, what if you could simplify this process and help you stay compliant? And wanted to walk you through some of the key pieces of that. So the first one, and we discussed this again a little bit before, but you want to make sure that you have out-of-the-box control for RP 755. Many organizations we've worked with have tried to build something themselves, or have gone with tools where they say, hey, we can build any type of rule, just, you know, program in RP 755 yourself. I think that is a very difficult path to go down. You're going to want to have a tool that has RP 755 built in out of the box, but then you also want to have control over your policies. So we've some organizations may want to go with exactly what RP 755 dictates, but you may also want to change some of those limits and have control over things to match your organizational preferences. Maybe you want to be even more restrictive in certain areas. So that's a really critical piece to be able to set this up quickly and help automate it. The second piece that is critical is that scheduling is critical to staying in compliance with RP 755. You know, the old adage, you know, if you don't plan well, you won't be able to execute, is really applicable here. And there are sort of two scenarios that we often see that get people into trouble. One is that they are not building a plan in the first place that will be in compliance with RP 755. So as you are scheduling overtime and walking through those overtime practices, they don't take into account RP 755 when they're giving out overtime. And so you may give somebody too many shifts now, which might be allowed by the rules, but now later on in their process of working their regular shift pattern, now they've broken the rules. They've gotten too many shifts in a row. And that's one thing you really want to make sure is taken into account. The second one is kind of what we highlight here, is what happens when somebody calls in sick at the last moment, right before their shift, and you have to do a call out or bring somebody in at the last minute. Those processes where, you know, you don't have a lot of time, you need to make sure the right person comes in and there's limited people available. We see that that is another scenario which can cause a lot of problems. So with SchedulePro, you get end-to-end automated scheduling, one-click auto schedule. But even when you're making individual scheduling changes, the rules are always running to tell you whether or not this move will cause issues today or even down the line in your schedule. So you know, you want to make sure that you know what you need to do when somebody calls in sick, and have full visibility into the coverage of your employees. And then when you open that up and you look at your schedule of who can backfill for any opening, this is where you want to make sure that your system is optimized for your workflow and you have all of the information you need. So when RP 755 really kicks in, though, is in these exception cases. So call-out scheduling was one of the key items that was listed, and you want to make sure that there are your process for how you do callouts is automated, or at least built in, that you have all the right people who can do this, and that all of your rules are always running. So this isn't just your RP 755 rules, but all of the other rules, training rules, OSHA, maybe you have state level rules. Do you know what's going to happen? And similarly, are the people who fail rules, can you filter them out and say, I know whether or not they're going to cause a violation or not. And again, looking at not just today and looking retroactively, but looking forward. And this is where there is a line between saying, okay, well, when I do a good plan versus tools that just say, I'm going to look retroactively, I'm going to just look at the data coming out of punch clocks or data coming from payroll. At the end of the day, the problem is that if there is a call out and you bring somebody in, and now tomorrow or next week when they're back on their regular shifts, they are going to be in violation, you're just creating problems down the line for yourself. And if you then have more violations or deviations from RP 755, or you then have to give people rest breaks and you're short-staffed next week. So a little bit of planning up front can make a huge difference to your processes, and automating the call-out procedures so that they follow RP 755 is a big part of compliance. The other part is that they want to make sure that you have a clear exception process. So again, in SchedulePro now, anytime you break the rules, you have the ability to make business decisions. Sometimes you may have nobody else to schedule except for somebody who breaks RP 755. But now you as a scheduler or a supervisor who's making that decision, you can document your reasons. You can say everything that you've done and keep an audit log of exactly why that deviation occurred. And again, you can run reports on that after the fact. So creating that exception process and that documentation of what occurs is a critical part of your full FRMS solution. The support for your supervisors when they need to do that individual risk assessment is critical. And who is at risk? Right now, when you do things manually, your supervisors may not actually know which employees they need to go talk to on the day of their shift. Who are the ones we need to do that risk assessment for? Having a dashboard which instantly calls out, these are my employees in my group that I need to go talk to, and kind of being able to see, okay, well, this is ongoing. Is there, a lot of people who are in violation or not? Can I go look at this, and what are the risk factors? Which rules are being violated? Allows the supervisor to instantly go and make sure that they're having the right conversations with the people who are most at risk. And then one of the last steps that was critical in building out an FRMS was that you need to be doing periodic reviews of the effectiveness of your FRMS. And there are a number of different factors. There was staffing levels, how workload balance, and also your levels of compliance and deviations, all things you're going to want to look at. Having those KPIs and having the analytics to back that information up is important. And our goal here with SchedulePro was, well, let's not make it a once a year or once in a blue moon type activity. Can this be happening continuously, so that now you move from having a task to go get this data to continuous KPIs and continuous tracking on all of those factors? And then drilling into your FRMS side of things and deviations, these are some of the key pieces of information you're going to want to know. So, looking back over the last 24 months, what have the trends been? And why did we get better, or maybe did we get worse? What are the reasons for why violations are occurring? So you can track all those reasons. Is there a pattern that we're seeing? And where are these violations occurring? So a lot of just data that you can drill into to really hone in your FRMS system to make sure that you are running effectively and that the system is having the the intended effects, that you are actually following the rules and really looking at fatigue. So those are just some of the key snapshots of how an automated solution can kind of bring those pieces of data right to your fingertip of the day-to-day work, as well as the planning and annual sort of review work. So the key thing to really think about, when you're building an RP 755 solution, which we really care about, is you really want to make sure that you're automating the process, that you really look at the bigger picture of employee fairness, overtime equalization, along with compliance, all the union agreements, and you really need to make sure you're preventing violations before they happen. If you aren't looking proactively, then you will take actions today that will be getting you in trouble down the line, and that is absolutely critical to a successful rollout of RP755. For more information about how we were able to do this and what a rollout would look like, we have a case study with Shell Oil online that you can go and download. We'll send you the link as well. But so far, that has been our broadest RP755 rollout, where we were able to complete rollout across 8 refineries in under a year at Shell across all of their US refineries. So if you're curious about what that process was and some of the learnings and lessons learned, please do download that case study that we have online. So wanted to switch gears now, unless there was other questions that came through. I haven't seen anything pop up yet, but want to switch gears now to revision 2 of RP755 and what's changing and what to expect with the release of that new revision. So according to the timeline, as we sort of discussed, the revision 2 is imminent. The full text has not been publicly released, so I can't show you what it says internally. But what I can commit to as a company and as somebody who is very much focused on RP755, EDP software and our SchedulePro product will have full out-of-the-box support for RP755 revision 2 on day 1 of its release. So we are committing to make sure that all of our customers have everything that they need to move to the revision 2 version, and they can choose when that rollout happens. They will be in full control, but we will have full support of it on day 1 of its release. And for any new and prospective customers, you can be very sure that we have this built out of the box for any rollouts that are occurring. And we're really proud of our sort of commitment to the oil and gas industry. Many other systems out there are still struggling to build their full support for revision 1 after several years, and we definitely feel like we will be by far the earliest to support revision 2. So,
hey, Sachin, I had a question that I might want to ask that came through.
Yes.
One of them was, what would be the common implementation challenges? What are they that you might see?
Perfect. Yeah. So, you know what? I'll actually answer that as part of maybe this process where we talk through what's changed, and I think that might be a good place to jump into that. We definitely covered more of that in detail in our last webinar, but happy to kind of talk through some of the key challenges there. So I'll definitely touch on that here in a couple of slides. So what's changed in the new version of revision 2 of RP755? There's been a lot of technical under the covers changes. Many of the things help make it a little bit more simple to understand. So they've removed the different classification of the hourly type of the employee. So 8-hour versus 10-hour employees. And now they just have 2 buckets. Are you a day worker or are you a shift worker with a rotating pattern? And so that's a great simplification. And in the revision 1, there was a lot of complexities around depending on how many hours you work and how long your shifts are, would you be considered an 8, 10, or 12-hour employee? They've kind of removed all of that complexity. And those changes, while infrequent, did make the rule very hard to debug and understand for people who are seeing rules that they weren't expecting. So removing that, I think, makes the rule much easier to understand. And then the other big one that I think where people who are familiar with the rule set is they've changed the idea of the work sets being specified in terms of number of shifts to being hours. So if you remember RP755, the thing that people remember sort of says you can work 7 shifts, which is, again, in the previous webinar, we talked about the difference between a work set and days in a row. There's a nuanced difference. Now it's no longer going to be defined as just 7 shifts. It's going to be in terms of number of hours. And the calculation of that's a little bit unique in terms of some of the pieces. They've added in a few key items. So they've added in new restriction on call-out shifts and how those hours are counted. In revision 1, there really wasn't a whole lot about call-outs, so they sort of said if the call-out was short, you don't even count it. And now that the call-outs are being counted and they are being part of the fatigue policy, which is, I think, very important. And then the other addition is that they've now put a minimum time off of returning to work for any shift. And in revision 1, it only applied if you had an extended shift. I think this is important as well, because it really forces, it really works together with the new call-out restrictions. And from a fatigue standpoint, it seems to align with the science of keeping people safe. It does make things a little bit more complicated to manage, though. So here, I think, I'll touch upon your question here a little bit, Grant, and but what impact can you expect in your sort of operating environment? So compared to revision 1, you're going to have more flexibility to handle holdovers. There's been some flexibility added to the rules, but the flip side that you'll find more restrictions is this minimum time off between shifts, and that's requiring 8 hours before you come back to work. So in the revision 1 version of the rule, you could have a call out in the middle of the night, and there was nothing forcing you to say that you had to have a break before coming back. Now that minimum of 8 hours off before you come back in will affect maintenance schedules. Maintenance now has more flexibility on weekend work, and for organizations that were working a 5/8 schedule, one of the challenges that was in revision 1 was the limits didn't allow you to work a Saturday and a Sunday shift. You had to have one of the 2 days off as a reset for your work set. And I think that caused a lot of challenges for folks doing maintenance work, where they said, well, this person we need somebody to work a Saturday and a Sunday in a row because we have a special project. It's a 2-day thing. It really caused some disruptions to being able to get some special work done. And then all in all, in terms of being from an operations perspective, I think the 12-hour employees, what most of you are probably doing in your operations group, you're not going to see too many changes to the way that their scheduling occurs. The limits, while defined differently from a everyday means, will be the same in terms of what would occur 99% of the time. So for those folks, it will feel, version 1 and version 2 will feel very similar. For folks on the management side of things, though, now there are some definite changes for things you need to keep in mind. As I alluded to, the counting of the hours of service limits is more complex. So before, it was relatively easy. You could count up to 7 shifts. Now it's based on hours, and also you have to count the hours that occur between call-outs, which makes it a little bit more difficult to do by hand. So it definitely pushes the day-to-day management into something that requires some help or some tooling to go do. But because they've simplified the extended shifts rule, the edge cases, or the things that happen infrequently, have become much easier. So from a management perspective, that is, I think, really good. Those edge cases that happen once in a blue moon were very hard on people because it was hard to remember those. While the ruling the rule says you can have a maximum of 18-hour shifts, it's still an exception that you have to do fatigue management work for. That was sort of the upper bound limit. The practical reality is, from an operations perspective, because now you need 8 hours off before returning to work, in all cases, an 18-hour shift really isn't practical anymore, because that 6-hour break before they have to come back now becomes 8 hours, and how do you fill in that 2-hour gap? And so the fact of an 18-hour shift, I think most organizations I talk to, they try to avoid it. With revision 2, it becomes even more difficult to have those. And again, as I discussed earlier, the night callouts may require time off for the employees before they are allowed to come back. So that really affects maintenance. So what are the common issues that people may see with RP755 in a rollout? From an operational perspective and just rolling it out, it's often related to many of these things. So I think one of the areas that we see most frequently people sort of complain about is one, hey, I used to be able to work this call out or this holdover type shift and get this overtime. I no longer can. I'm now being restricted. And the second one for employees is, especially those employees that love overtime and do a lot of overtime, the total amount of overtime that they can work or their percentage of overtime tends to get capped a little bit. So those overtime hogs tend to be restricted. So from an employee perspective, those tend to be the complicated items, or at least the ones that cause some grief. From a day-to-day management of your organization, it's these day-to-day changes in the edge cases, making sure that people have these breaks before they return to work. Learning how to plan for that ahead of time is where people seem to have the most challenges. And we see that most organizations, usually when they're rolling out for the first time, it's about a 3 to 4 month process before the number of deviations really start to taper off and come down. So when you first roll it out, expect that there will be a relatively high number of deviations. For more numbers around that in terms of what you can expect in terms of overtime hours, please review the last webinar we had. We have run some statistics in terms of what you can expect the maximum number of overtime percentage would be for any individual employee. So moving on to the path, Billy, I think reviewed this in terms of the timelines of what's required in terms of 90 days and the path and the 1 year time frame for compliance with RP755. That's really the key numbers for those represented sites. You know, if you do need some help and working with EDP, we can help enhance your FRMS proposal of how you are going to do the end-to-end FRMS. And SchedulePro can help you be part of that initial assessment. So what will RP755 do to your organization and your staffing levels? Do you have enough people? Do you have the right cross-training? We can help you understand those implications and help you create an implementation plan of how you would roll out a tool or how you could roll out information to all of your sites. And rolling out a special offer to all the attendees here on the call, and we'll also be rolling it out to any of the attendees at the LRHR conference that's occurring next week. We are going to be offering a free one-time evaluation of your schedules against RP755, so both against RP755 Revision 1 and Revision 2. And we think that that's going to be important because it'll allow you to understand how many deviations you have against your current schedules and what the changes would need to be. So how close are you? How much impact do you think this is going to have to your day-to-day operations? I think that that information will really help you plan forward, especially from an HR perspective, if there needs to be any training plans or hiring plans required. So that was the core of the prepared data that I had. I wanted to, I guess, push it back out to the audience. I kind of quickly went over a lot of data here. I figured we'd open it up to questions and some comments.
Hey, Sachin, Billy again. How flexible is your, you showed your dashboard and the kind of data that you can pull out. How flexible is that as customizing it to what kind of data you wanted, whether it's absenteeism,
Hey, Billy, could you just repeat the last part? I think you got cut off there at the very end in terms of absenteeism.
I was just looking to try to understand the flexibility of pulling data out using your system. You showed the dashboard, and it showed a couple of data elements that you could pull out. Is it anything that's in the payroll system that you could pull out in the dashboard, like sickness, absenteeism, whatever happens to be reported in the payroll system, or is it limited?
Yeah, so it is a very flexible process we have. So out of the box, we have a large number of reports that you can run, and all those reports can then be exported to whatever system you want to do additional analysis if you wish. Our BI and analytics tool that I took some screenshots of that you saw there, that one, there are pre-built views in there which specialize in each of those different buckets as you were talking about, reviewing overtime, reviewing absenteeism, and then within those reports they're fully interactive and you can drill through into details. You can do all sorts of different cross-filtering. It's highly interactive, so it's a full BI and analytics tool for kind of diving in and finding that information that you need.
One of the questions that has come through, Sachin, is what can you differentiate between SchedulePro and FRMS?
Yeah, that's a good question. So SchedulePro is part of your end-to-end FRMS system. So as we kind of talked about, building out an FRMS is both a technical challenge, and there are some internal business processes and challenges or procedures that you need to build out in a skill set. So SchedulePro is a technical solution to your FRMS challenges, but just deploying SchedulePro is not enough. You also need to make it part of a full program for it to be effective. But I do consider SchedulePro as an FRMS tool to be used for your organization. So it's not an or, we are part of the solution.
Oh, excellent. And Billy, there's a couple of questions for you. One is, what has the impact of RP 755 been with the unions from the history from day one to now? How they
well, the local unions have been against it. All right, the fight, the international has been in favor of implementing API 755, but the local unions have fought us on it because, you know, I think Sachin said earlier, where you wind up when you are implementing API 755, you reduce overtime from the high overtime workers and you force the low overtime workers to work, and that's difficult for a local union to accept, and that's something you have to work through.
Okay, I guess that kind of answered the second question, which was how many local agreements are adopting the national letter of intent. So you've kind of answered that. Correct, or did I lose you?
No, that's correct. I mean, you know, and that goes back to even my original question that every NOBP refinery has accepted this side letter. I don't know of any NOBP refinery that has not accepted the letter. So I forget what, and again, I apologize, I forget what that number is, but it's a pretty significant number of refineries.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Billy. One of the other questions that I have, Sachin, that's come up is what were the costs between the RP 755 V1 to V2 bin, and or V0 to V1? What impact has that been, or is that for an entity looking at adapting?
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge or question, and I kind of go back here to the slides that talk about some of the impacts. So from a cost perspective as an organization, you know, anytime you roll out a program, obviously there's going to be some cost, just in the very fact that you are now managing more. The switch from V1 to V2 is actually probably not a very large cost. And the reason I say that is that the limits are relatively similar in terms of the total amount of work any employee can do. I think on the maintenance side of things, the additional flexibility that they gave to day workers is important. I think it probably makes things a little bit easier on a day-to-day perspective. It'd probably be hard to quantify it, but it's I think it'll definitely make rolling out RP755 easier for those that didn't roll out revision 1. When you talk about going from no fatigue management tool to having one, we kind of discussed this in the last webinar, and there are potential cost increases. So if you can't work as much and you have to keep your plant running, then if you don't have enough staff, you may need to hire additional staff. And that requires some analysis and looking at your current staffing levels, looking at what your current overtime rates are. The other issue that we see people getting into is that if they don't have enough cross-training between the various posts and roles that they have within their organization, then there could be localized challenges. So if you're short-staffed in terms of training in 1 or 2 jobs, and those people end up working a lot of overtime, well, now in order to be in compliance, they can't work that much overtime, and now you need to get other people trained up. So there often is costs in terms of cross-training that we see. But one of the interesting things that we saw with working with many of our customers is that the process of going through that cross-training exercise and organizing your schedules and using automation and tooling, we actually saw many of our customers reducing their total costs by implementing SchedulePro and even with RP755. So the fact that a tool is now managing overtime, making sure that you're as optimized as possible, spreading out overtime across everybody who can possibly work it, and managing absenteeism, total costs actually stayed flat or sometimes went down. And the other area that we've had some customers tell us that it's helped is where it is a tight job market right now, and many people, it's not a question of overtime, it's just there aren't enough people, we can't hire enough people. And again, getting more utilization out of your employees and making sure that every resource is appropriately allocated allowed them to do more with the same number of people. So it could either reduce costs or it can kind of defer additional hiring. So I think to kind of summarize it is that overall, in terms of staffing costs and people costs, it may make changes to your organization. An analysis can tell you, but sometimes it can also be positive. But the biggest costs really will be in the training and management of this new program and getting people up to speed, and working through the process of going from no FRMS program to something that is quite rigorous.
Excellent. Thanks, Sachin. Unless there's any other questions, if anybody wants to ask them now, I've gotten most of them. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for attending. We had a good couple of people drop off in the last couple of minutes here, but we will certainly make this webinar link available to you guys in the next couple of days. We'll have it on our website and our blog, and we'll make the deck available in PDF to some folks if they would like it. They can send that information to the info@scheduleprosoftware.com. Otherwise, we'll let any other final comments, Billy or Sachin?
Nothing from my side.
I'm good here.
Okay, and I'll just make a note that we have a couple of resources page that I'll have on the website, fairly sure, on the case study from Shell, how Shell Oil manages RP755. We have our last webinar that we did, past, present, and future, and a video on simplifying RP755 through the USW facilities. And we also have a web white paper on employee scheduling for RP755 and a new SchedulePro and RP755 fact sheet. So I'll make sure those are available to the folks. And again, thank you very much, and I'll give you guys back your Friday afternoon. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.